So,
You probably don't need to, you probably don't need to be too far away from it.
no. So,
I think
how do we know to start? Hmm?
He's going to introduce us.
Sound.
Is that the universal sign?
Hmm?
1 2 1 2. One, two. It's on. It says it's on. 1 2 1 2. Hello, hello. There we go. There we go. Okay, folks, if we'll come in and have a seat, we're getting ready to get started again. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Come have a seat.
Person speaking.
He's got a mic.
That one's mine.
Where are we? Where's that voice
That
coming
one's mine.
Dude, he's got a hand.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed the last two sessions. And I'll hear about the one in the other room shortly. But at this point, I'd like to turn things over to Peter Ennis, who is the chief sacristan here at Trinity at St. John the Divine. And he'll Trinity Divine, right? Trinity Divine. Okay. probably a job title reduction, though. Okay. Anyway, I'll turn it over to Peter, and you're on your own.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here and welcome to the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And just some housekeeping to begin with. We ask that if you are not eating or drinking, that you stay masked. That is the protocol at the cathedral. And there's a change. This discussion is about change in the time of crisis. And this is an example of one of them. Unplanned work is being done in the chapel where we were going to have the Eucharist. So we're moving the Eucharist from St. Martin's to St. James Chapel, which is the first chapel as you go up the ramp over here. So for those who want to go to the Eucharist, that's where you will be. And it's my pleasure to introduce the acting Dean of the Cathedral, Very Reverend Patrick Malloy, former Dean of General Theological Seminary and the Cathedral, St. John's Cathedral in Denver.
In the wilderness. St. John in the Wilderness.
St. John in the Wilderness in Denver, where we had our 2019 conference, I think, or 2018. So, welcome, and I think if you want to welcome the people to the cathedral from your side.
Sure. Well, welcome to everyone from across North America.
And even Africa.
Oh, and Africa
and the
too.
UK.
And the UK. Oh, okay, great. And to those of you from the Commonwealth, especially those of you from the UK, but from the entire Commonwealth, our condolences on the death of Her Majesty the Queen. I know that this must be, I mean, it's sad for all of us. It must be unbelievably sad for you. So we here at the Cathedral have been holding you in our common prayer and will continue to do so. But welcome to the Cathedral. I haven't been here for your earlier session, so I don't know what you know about the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. The Cathedral, the building of the Cathedral building was started in 1872, so we're in about our 150th year, really. The Cathedral was built at a time when two things were happening. There was incredible immigration here in New York, but across the United States. But in particular, people came through Ellis Island here in New York. And it was a time, too, when the church was really just first beginning to embark upon the ecumenical journey. And many of you may know the document, the Chicago Quadrilateral, that became the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral, that set up sort of the bare bones that we as Episcopalians would require for entering into what we would call full communion with any other church. It's only happened so far in all this time that we've only entered into full communion with two churches, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and the Moravian Church. where we could find the 4 points of the quadrilateral met. But nonetheless, at the time that this cathedral was built, people were very interested in ecumenism and immigration. And so the cathedral really is about those two things. If you go into the apse, where we'll go for the Holy Communion, you'll see that there's 7 apsidal chapels. Each one was intended for a particular nationality and language group, where they would come. The idea was everyone would come to this great place. This would be the place that America would pray, and that eventually, frankly, everyone would see the light and join the Episcopal Church. This is simply, I'm sorry, but that is true. Ecumenism is different now than it was then. So this really is a place of gathering. This is arguably the largest cathedral in the world, and arguably the 3rd largest church in the world, though you hear anything from 3 to 6. So we're somewhere between the 3rd and the 6th largest church in the world, and as Peter will tell you, for big events we can get, what, 3,000 people in here?
Yep.
Yeah. So that's the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and we're really delighted that you're with us. One last thing, and then I'll shut up. The Cathedral of St. John the Divine is perhaps unique in the entire Episcopal Church, insofar as we do not have there is no congregation of St. John the Divine. The cathedral was founded with the notion that this would be the church of the entire Diocese of New York, if not the entire city of New York, and in order for it to belong to everyone, it was decided that it would belong to no one. So this church belongs to every Episcopalian in the entire Diocese of New York. There is nothing called the Congregation of St. John the Divine. However, there has always been hangers-on, people who just keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. So there became a de facto congregation, even if there was no actual congregation. And so 30 years ago, this weekend, actually, this coming weekend, the Bishop of New York decided that he would allow them to form a congregation that met at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And they're called the Congregation of Saint Savior. But they, in a sense, are a mission of the cathedral, which means they do not choose their own priest. They do not have anything to do with the building or the liturgy or any of that. They're simply a group of people who come here every Sunday to pray and who have their own priest, but it's a priest that the dean appoints for them. So that's, I think, so that gives you a sense of what this place is about, I hope. And I hope that's all you need to know.
Okay. I was thinking, I was a part-time worker at the cathedral from around 2015, and as a verger, you arrived, I think, June 2016.
June 30th.
You remember the day exactly?
It's my birthday.
That it was?
Yeah, I arrived on my birthday. Anyway.
Happy belated birthday.
Thank you.
So, what was your first impressions of the cathedral and the liturgies at the cathedral when you arrived here? And would you consider it was in crisis?
Well, that wasn't exactly a crisis. Actually, for me, it was a crisis. Coming from Denver back to New York was kind of a crisis. Is Bill Gleason in the room? No, he's not.
He should be, because he's staying in an Airbnb on 105th Street.
Oh, I know that one of the vergers from St. John of the Wilderness is here.
I should not have said that.
I didn't immediately discover anything, but I slowly came to discover something, and this is going to surprise all of you, because this is nothing any of you have ever experienced anywhere in your work. And that is that I discovered that the liturgy at the cathedral was stuck and that people were incredibly resistant to change. Now, I know that's something that's unique to this place, but that is what I discovered. And I also discovered that most of the reason things were done the way they were done is because that's the way they'd always been done. So that's the thing that I first discovered.
Yep. So it wasn't too long after that I guess we had our first big crisis, and that was the Palm Sunday fire that we had. We were preparing for services. The 9 o'clock service was actually happening, and we were preparing. We're going to do a gathering outside, procession through the bronze doors into the cathedral, when suddenly the place filled with smoke because of a fire in the basement below St. Saviour's Chapel. And we were thrown off because it was Easter week coming up. A lot of crisis of how do we do Easter, for one. But then after that was also the period of cleaning of the cathedral, because there wasn't major damage from the fire, but there was a lot of soot that covered this whole place, and they had to clean the building from one end to the other, top to bottom, which forced us to move our services around and figure out how we're going to do it and where we're going to do that.
It was, as Peter said, front to back, top to bottom. It was amazing. There were, hundreds of workers here at a time with these sponges, these chemically infused sponges, literally like scrubbing the entire place. Because this is something I didn't know, that the smoke is corrosive. I mean, it's not just dirty, it's actually corrosive. So if they don't get it off the stone, it undermines the integrity of the building. But that meant there were these lifts. I mean, can you get people hanging from the ceiling, lifts going all the way up the walls, the sorts of things you see like on the construction sites of skyscrapers. And so we had to keep moving around this project that went on for months, right?
Yeah. And it's like we were moving services from, if they were cleaning on this side, we'd do services in the nave. If they were cleaning in the nave, we'd move services back here.
And we were constrained by the organ. I don't know if, have you talked to them about what's going on in this room? Okay.
Not really.
Okay. What's happening in the room is, if you look up here, you see all this scaffolding in the choir? That scaffolding is there so that the organ pipes could come down. The organ pipes some of them are enormously big, and there are little spiral staircases that go up into the pipe chamber. The chambers are along both sides of the choir. You literally cannot get some of those pipes down those stairs. And some of the other pipes you probably could, but you might bump them and dent them, and then that would incapacitate the organ. So they built these, all this scaffolding was built so they could bring the pipes down. So our organ right now is in St. Louis? Somewhere in the flyover states. So somewhere out in the Midwest is where our organ is. And our organ has
A couple of thousand.
Thousands and thousands of pipes. So because the reason was the organ was on for the 9 o'clock Eucharist, and the air is constantly circulating, and the fear was that this corrosive smoke had been sucked through all the pipes. So they just shut the organ off, and then we had to send the organ out. Luckily, our music director is the organist at Carnegie Hall, as well as sometimes at Lincoln Center. And so he was able to secure for us this great electronic organ. So if you look in the back there, you see these black curtains. You see those on either side? Those hide the speakers for the electronic organ that we've been using since 2019. It's a really good electronic organ. I mean, if you're standing in most of the room, it sounds like an actual organ. If you get really close to it, it sounds like a really bad stereo system. But if you're in the most of the room, it sounds fine. But what that meant was the musicians have to be right there. So we have this enormously large room. It's the length of 2 football fields. Because the musicians have to be right there, it really does restrict what we can do in here.
I think also what we were looking at the time was how can we change the liturgy to be more simplified to accommodate moving into these different areas, and constantly changing, because it was sometimes the acolytes would come in and on a Sunday morning, it's like, oh, we're doing church over here now. And so we tried to narrow it down, like these are simple steps. This is what the minimum that we need to do church. And I think out of it came a sense of we could do that in a very dignified way. Some of the history before was when I came here that, and I know Verger's conference usually beat up on the acolytes. It was a little disorganized how they were functioning, and it was almost like a pickup game every Sunday to see who's going to come and serve. And we would have 3 full cross teams, and the next Sunday there'd be 3 people, so they'd send out 3 crosses. You never had the same configuration, and we just decided to cut it down. We're going to have 1 cross team, Verger, Thurifer, and make it simple and make it look good. And I think that sort of translated to everything that we do now, that it sort of cut away the waste and concentrate on what you really need and how do you do it good.
Yeah, Peter, I think Peter's pointing to something really important. I mean, you all know Rahm Emanuel, and probably not really him, but because he's hated by everyone on the right, they always tend to blame him. Rahm Emanuel is credited as having said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Now, whether he actually said that or not, he's sort of belittled for it by certain people in the political spectrum. I think if Rahm Emanuel said that, he deserves a medal, because I think that's really true. I think you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think what the crisis of the fire did for us is it allowed us to step back and ask what we really were doing here. And it also freed us up from something that, as I mentioned to you, I confronted when I came here. Namely, we've always done it this way, and it cannot be done any other way. When you completely have to give up the space where you do things, you've got to reimagine them. You have no choice. So by being exiled from, this is where we normally did the Sunday Eucharist, right? In the middle of this dome, there was a big high platform where the altar stood. And there were a lectern and a pulpit, and everyone sat up here, and there was a certain way everything happened. Well, you just can't do that any place except in this space. So when we were then moved, we could ask questions like, why is it on the fourth Sunday after Pentecost you have 27 acolytes, and on the next Sunday you have 2? And then Easter comes, and because everyone is so exhausted from Holy Week, you have 1. So you have 1 acolyte on Easter Sunday, and you have 47 on the second Sunday after Pentecost. And we began saying, this is simply, there's no rationality to this. And this shake-up, this fire, allowed us to rationalize the whole thing, to make sense of the whole thing, without people saying, but you can't do that. We absolutely, that's not how we do it here. So it really was a blessing. The fire for us was oddly a sort of blessing. I mean, would you say that?
Yeah, it's a challenge and test tube, but through the process of reimagining things and planning, it is satisfying when you look at the final results and it makes sense, and to the people it makes sense. I'm just looking at the altar that we have in the back there. It's one of the interesting things when we had this. It wasn't really an altar. It was a movable.
It was a prop.
It was a prop. It was a really big rectangular altar that we used over there. And I think it's at the time that we moved out into the nave the first time, and we gathered everybody around the altar. It looked kind of out of place in that spot in the room. And you had the idea of looking to see if we can get a new altar, and you had a new altar made, which is in the back there. It's a square altar. And the sense that I get from people is when they saw it for the first time, it made them feel much more gathered around a table. And the table doesn't have a front side and a back side. Because it was interesting, when we had the altar over here, we'd have seating around and even in the back here. But the rectangular altar over here, the celebrant will be on this side. People didn't want to sit behind the celebrant. And suddenly with that altar, that all went kind of away.
That's an example, I think, if it weren't for all of the fire and everything, I cannot imagine the work it would have done to convince people that the altars can be square. I think it would have just absolutely, they would have said that's not true. No such thing has ever existed in Christendom. Everyone knows that when Jesus celebrated the first Mass, it was at a rectangular altar with a Laudian frontal on it. So when but there was an enormous altar, because see, I mean, in this room, everything's got to be enormous, right? So the altar really wasn't that much smaller than that altar. And I don't know, you should stand at that altar. I mean, that might not look big to you. That is so big. And when a human being is standing behind it, she looks like this big. I mean, it's enormous. So the altar down here, to be in scale, was not quite that big, but it was pretty close. Yeah. But it wasn't really an altar. It was a theater prop. It was in pieces. And it got thrown around and was dented. And when you took the frontal off of it, you realized it really wasn't an altar. It was a theater prop. And so we decided to get an altar that really it's a consecrated altar. We had a bishop consecrated. And one that was scaled so that we could really gather people around it. When it first came into the room, I mean, it's a 6-foot square, And it seemed incredibly big, didn't it?
Yeah.
Like we just couldn't believe it. We said, "Oh my God, what have we done?" But now, you know, really, it's very much to scale, and we're really used to it. But that's another example of how the crisis allowed us to make some changes that have been for the good of the order.
So after the fire and the cleaning that happened at the time, we also found that there were pieces of rock or concrete or something falling from the ceiling. So having gone through the cleaning, we sort of had to go through the inspection of the ceiling, where we were back in turmoil as to where are we doing service, because now they're going to inspect over here, now they're going to inspect over there. Total chaos again. But I think we already started the process of being mobile enough to move around and organize ourselves. And the basics were down, so then it made it much easier to make the changes. And this being a large cathedral and also the mother church of the Diocese of New York, big services would happen here. And one of our big services is Absalom Jones in the middle of February, where the congregations gather over here. And it was interesting because the service used to be focused on the high altar area with the choir. And we couldn't do it anymore, and we actually had to do it in the nave. No, the first one was in the crossing. And they were like, well, we don't think that's going to really work. And we made it happen, and people loved it. It's like, well, let's not go back there again. So just changing the location of where you do stuff, and if you can do it well, right, convinces people that, you know, it works.
Now I'm going to tell you something else that's going to surprise you. So again, this is unique to us. Bishops don't like change. And when we began, because the church was all big, I mean, can you imagine the kind of equipment it takes to get people literally like up there? I mean, it's these are huge machines. So eventually this became inaccessible to us, and it came time for the Chrism Mass, or whatever you call it in your diocese. And we always did it at the high altar because there was this sense that that was the most special place in the entire world, you know. And we just said we couldn't do it, and we had to do it out here in the crossing. And what we found, you tell me, but what we found is the clergy were over the moon. Like they felt a kind of ownership of the Chrism Mass in a way they never did before, gathered around the Lord's table. So gradually what we came to be aware of was, while these things in the beginning seemed like just sort of ways to deal with the crisis, like we have to deal with this crisis, they actually became opportunities where all sorts of good things happened precisely because we were willing to break out of the box. But I'm wondering, because we have so many more crises to talk about. Oh, it's 11:09. Okay. We have plenty of time.
We have plenty of time.
So what happened next?
Well, I think the big thing after that was the pandemic.
Ah, yes. The pandemic.
The pandemic. And I remember for myself at the time, it was like, oh, we'll be shut down for a couple of weeks. And, you know, this is going to be over in no time. And we had just had ordinations, deacons' ordination the week before. We decided that Sunday everything was the next Sunday everything was shut down, that we would live stream a service, and we did it from St. James. And
because God is good.
You were away.
I was in California because Jesus loves me. And so I missed all of this.
Yeah, you were on vacation while we had to deal with a pandemic breaking out over here. Anyway, we had the service over there, and it, to me, was a very strange experience. We had Bishop Dici was there, Bishop Glasspool was there, Patty Walsh was there. She was at the time the chaplain at the Cathedral School, and a handful of us, and sound people. I mean, we had nothing. We have not done this before, So we had to get an audio-visual team together to broadcast the service, but it seemed very strange. It was like there was nobody there. The choir, there was a choir as well. So after we were thinking like, what are we going to do now? Because it seemed like this is going to continue much longer, and everything was going to have to happen live. And I think the first couple of services, was it on Zoom or? No, we just live streamed.
It was something, but we did it live, which turned out, again, I don't know what you folks experienced. We didn't know how to do this. We had no idea how to do this. And we have a good audio-visual crew, but they didn't know how to do this. So, like, we kept crashing the internet. And I think it might have been because so many churches were trying to stream services, but we literally, we broke the internet, right? And so we just couldn't, we realized we couldn't do this.
Yeah. So we decided that the format of the Sunday service that we were going to have would be the Liturgy of the Word. And it was actually recorded on Fridays, usually, or Thursdays, everybody remotely. And we sort of consciously made the decision that the clergy will be at home, color, but not vested. We had people doing the readings. The choir would make videos with software that they have these days of doing that. So our service developed into a word service, very short, very simple, but it was sort of on an equal level. Everybody was at home. Some weren't stuck in a church, empty church. Others were in home. And from your perspective, what was that like as the clergy person?
Well, especially in the beginning, it was just so strange. Because I would be sitting in my dining room, like we'd preach. It would be this liturgy of the word. So the priest would preach. And I would literally be talking to the green dot on my laptop, you know. It was very, very strange. But the thing about it was, we made a conscious decision that we were going to endure the strangeness, that we were not going to pretend that the church was open and no one was coming. We certainly were not going to celebrate the Eucharist when there was no one to receive Holy Communion, which just made no sense. We were just all going to be at home together, locked in our homes. I think you also have to understand, I don't know what it was like where you came from. In New York City, we lost 57,000 people within the course of a couple weeks. We had refrigerated trucks, right? St. Luke's Hospital is right next door. People were just dying everywhere, and there was nobody on the streets. I mean, to tell you, nobody. It was silence except for ambulances. And so we did not attempt to pretend that life was normal in any way at all. So the reader stayed at home, the priest stayed at home, the choir sang sometimes the choir sang from their cars. There were people who couldn't get any place to be alone, so they would take their, phones into their cars and sing. And I think we learned a lot during that time. I think it created for us a sense of what you might call liturgical intimacy. That everyone sort of was on the same level playing field. The people who were ministering and the people who had just the ministry of being part of the assembly. We were all part of the same thing. And, but what's really interesting about that especially, and by the way, there were people who said, you've got to go into church and dress up. We miss the cathedral. And our attitude was, well, we all miss the cathedral, but let's be honest, there's no one in the cathedral, So we decided not to do it. But we also decided, and this is something Peter knows, because Peter really is for years now, since the first week of the pandemic, Peter has been the convening minister of our daily offices. Before the pandemic, we celebrated the office here every day, morning and evening, and I can tell you, virtually no one came. This cathedral, those of you who don't know New York, this is the first time you've been here, this is really in the middle of nowhere. In a funny kind of way. You really have to want to come to 110th and Amsterdam. This is not like St. Patrick's or St. Thomas Fifth Avenue. You're not going to trip across this place. And the chance of getting people to come up here from just to sit in the chapel and read morning prayer and evening prayer, if you had one that I'd come over, I'd wake up in the morning and stumble over here at 8 o'clock, and I think, why am I doing this? No one is going to come. And they almost never did. So, but we decided to keep the daily office going, and Peter assumed the ministry of the daily office. And that I think you need to hear about, because that has been one of the greatest successes of the pandemic, of the crisis leading us to such a remarkably good thing.
And that is something I kind of stumbled into. It wasn't planned. Right after we shut down, it was actually the young adults of the congregation of St. Savior that felt that there should be the daily offices. And I think we were doing it on Zoom, so we started gathering, and somebody came up with a couple of PowerPoint slides, and we went from there. It was also, maybe this is going to be 3-4 weeks we're done. That did not happen. Stuck at home. So, as all the liturgies at the cathedral are the liturgies of the cathedral, not of the congregation, we sort of assumed the control on that, and we went to doing morning prayer morning prayer and evening prayer, 8:30 and 5 o'clock, Monday through Saturday, and I prepare PowerPoint slides that has pretty much all the text that you need. I was sitting at home, what else did I have to do? Which was fine, and now I have almost 2 years complete for the readings, and I just have to go in and change the intercessions that change all the time. So that's not so bad. But after more than 2 years of this pandemic, we average about 16 to 18 people at morning prayer and 10 to 14 people at evening prayer every day. We never had that when we were in the cathedral. And as I started looking into I had to learn all about the daily office. I mean, I thought I knew something about it. I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. If you hear noise up there, they're doing some work up there. Nothing's falling down. You don't have to worry about it. And sometimes a little noisier than other times.
Although it might. You really never know, but probably not.
Yeah. Then working with how we were going to do morning prayer, I felt that it had to be interactive in some way, as interactive as you can be on Zoom. So the way we have it set up is we have the officiant that does the officiant's part. We have 2 people that would volunteer to do the readings, and we have 1 person act as the responder on behalf of everybody. Because I'm sure you know, if 10 people speak on Zoom, it sounds like Babylon. It is really crazy. And it's amazing that it has developed a community. And this community is not of the Diocese of New York. It is of the whole country. At times we've had people from Europe, sometimes from Canada, but we have regular people, 8:30 in the morning Eastern Time, from the West Coast. We have people from Detroit. We have people literally, there are times that are more people in the daily office that are not in the Diocese of New York than there are from the Diocese of New York. So it's really been remarkable. It became a ministry for me, which I did not sign up for. But we shared a lot of pain, a lot of loss. But everybody was holding each other up in that. So I don't see us coming back to in-person morning prayer and evening prayer in the cathedral, because it would kill what we have now, which I think is one of the big successes.
Yeah, and what Peter says about the people who make up that group, he's right. They're from all over the country. Many of them are not from the Diocese of New York. But I think that enough of them are, and enough of them are members of the congregation of St. Savior, or people who come to church here every Sunday, that my sense is that people have a stronger sense of church not just being something that happens on Sunday. So when people sort of come on Sunday, there's some of them who see people, they, oh my God, it's so nice to see you in real life. I've watched you on a screen for the last 7 days, you know. And so there's a kind of a warmth that it's built into our Sunday worship. And I also think it's made liturgy real. I do think one of the problems we in the Episcopal Church have is sometimes the liturgy becomes a straitjacket, and it becomes very unreal. We just sort of do it. We go through the motions, and it can be very detached from people's experience. One of the things that happens in these daily offices is, as you know, that the prayer book encourages people to pray spontaneously during the daily office, to share prayers, and these people do. And I mean, I don't go to the daily office because, of course, being a priest, I'm home having my very pious private devotions when they're saying the office. But what I do know is that they really, as Peter said, that you know, the sorrows, the losses, the joys. These people really do know about one another's lives, and it develops a kind of a. It means that I think the set liturgical texts come to have more depth because the people know one another's pain. I think when you think of the Psalms, I mean, what do the Psalms do? I mean, they do. It seems to me they do three things: they praise God, they scream at God, and they cry because life is so hard. I mean, that's what happens. Either you're praising God for the good things, you're yelling at God for the bad things, or you're huddling in tears. That's what the Psalms do. I just think all of that makes so much more sense to people when they know that the person whose face is there on the screen just lost a partner to COVID, or just had a child who was very ill, or who just finally got a new job. It all takes on a kind of a depth that it would lose if people didn't know one another that way.
You know, what's interesting is that makes me think of, if we're going to try not to get too emotional, with Clive Hicks. It was a congregation member. It was a congregation member that I knew. I'd seen him around, but I don't think he was that regular.
He was a 9 o'clocker.
Yeah. But, you know, he was an elderly gentleman. He was at home alone, and this was one of the ways that could communicate with people. And he died. He didn't die of COVID. But he became such a beloved member of this community that, you know, it's incredible. It's difficult for me to describe what that community is like and how we've touched each other's lives. One of the interesting things is after morning prayer, mostly evening prayer, not as much. Morning prayer, people would stick around and chat. And it could be a topic from the Psalms. It could be a topic from the news. It could be from the readings. And some of these discussions would go on for almost an hour about anything that anybody wanted to talk about. Or if it's somebody that was going through a really tough time, people were there to support them. To me, that is almost more church than Sunday is at times.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say how I really do appreciate your vulnerability. I think that it's a lovely thing. So that's kind of what happened, but can we step away from it a bit? Is those the ends of our crises? Are there more crises?
Well, I don't know if we want to talk a bit about like the services that we did have during the pandemic that we had to have.
Yes.
For instance,
That's good, like ordinations.
Ordinations, we had to get people ordained. And we worked with the bishop and the diocese on figuring out how we can do services in this place with the people that are needed to do the service. And we really spent a lot of time. Those services actually happened over here in the crossing. So we had to be aware of distancing,
Masking.
hand washing was a big thing at that time.
Hand washing.
And And live stream. We had to live stream these things. But it was really, we spent many days figuring out how we're going to do it, where we're going to place everybody so that they distance enough, and we rehearsed it. And it became really so much easier than the regular ordination services that can be a bit chaotic, that everybody, it was narrow, stripped down, but it's like everybody knew what they had to do, when to move. And one of the interesting things that came out of it is, that's from a live streaming point of view. We had one camera up on the pulpit over here, aimed down at where the bishop's chair was. Now, during ordinations, the bishop would anoint the hands of the new priests. Now, usually it happens up at the high altar over there, people sitting over here, maybe down here, they have no idea what's happening up there. Because somebody's kneeling in front of the bishop, something happens. There's a camera right here pointing down to what the action was that was happening. And so many people were saying that I had no idea that ever happened. This is the first time they've actually been able to see that up close. And that had to also get us to the point where everything that we do, we now have to keep in mind, what does it look like on camera? How does our movement influence what we do?
There's a story that's maybe apocryphal, but maybe not. I don't know if it's true. That there was this priest being ordained to the episcopate somewhere, and all the bishops went up and gathered round and to lay hands. And the priest, soon to become a bishop's son, said to the mother, "Mommy, what are they doing?" And she said, "Oh, sweetheart, they're removing his spine." But anyway, now whether or not that's a true story, I don't know, but it could be. So that's a good example. See, for all people knew that when the ordinand was kneeling in front of the bishop, he was removing their spine, but it wasn't. Let me say something about what Peter says is really good, and there's another thing that well, let me just say, the way we've learned to do ordinations now that the Christ is forced, I don't think we'll ever go back to the other way. Because it's just so much better. Because it's thought through so much more organically. We really had to think it through. So it isn't just, well, then we do this and then we do this. We spent weeks figuring out how to do an ordination where people had to be 6 feet apart at all times, and where the bishop had to wash his hands after he touched any human being in any conceivable way. I mean, it was unbelievable. It was like we were doing surgery. I mean, it was unbelievable. But we did it, and we did it in a graceful. We really said, how do you wash a person's hands that it doesn't feel like you're washing their hands, that doesn't feel antiseptic, although that's what you're aiming for. So that was really good. But the other thing we learned was, our custom up until that point had been we always do ordinations Saturday mornings at 10:30. And so what we used to do is we used to have the ordinands and the presenters come here for a rehearsal Friday evenings at 4, something like that. Well, it was a nightmare because
it's New York City. People don't get here.
For those of you who don't know New York, especially old New York before the pandemic, it's really hard to get around and to get here on time. And for people who don't know, like people from outside who don't know the subway system, and they try to drive here, it's just a nightmare. So people would always be late, or the presenters would say, well, I can't come, I have to work, and people would be running in late, and we'd have to keep starting over, and they'd all want to talk and hug one another, and it was, oh God, I hate all that friendly business. But anyway, what we just started doing is we decided we were going to do the rehearsals on Zoom. And Peter and I, it was summertime, first time, and I know this because we came over here, that we set the whole room up, and then we did little videos of what was going to happen to them. And I know it was summer because we were both in shorts. So, I would play the ordinand, and Peter would play the bishop, and we'd do these little iPhone videos of, then this is going to happen to you. So we did all these, this is how the vestments are going to go on you, and this is how you get your hands through the vestments. And it simplified our lives so much. And it also allowed all of these presenters who couldn't get here because of New York City traffic, everyone would come. So we would have these rehearsals we could have them a week before. We did them whenever anyone could get together. We'd set aside an hour on a Tuesday evening. We'd walk them through the service. We'd have photographs, video clips. So when they would come in Saturday morning, they'd get here like at 9 o'clock for a 10:30 service. And in 15 minutes, we could do the whole rehearsal. Just so they'd move around in the space. So we learned that there are lots more efficient ways to do things than we ever knew were possible. So it really has made our life much easier, wouldn't you say?
So I think we can leave some time for questions.
I do want to say one thing first.
Yeah, sure.
Stasis is generally not a good thing. We've always done it this way thing is not always a good way, especially because one of the things you know about the liturgy is like, it's like, the liturgy is like your grandmother's attic. It accumulates stuff. And once it's there, it's very difficult to get rid of it, even though no one knows where it came from or why you even have it. And if any of you who have ever cleaned out the homes of parents after they have died, you wonder, why is this here? Some things you understand, but most of it you say, why do we still have this? But it's hard to get rid of it. And the liturgy is like that. So that is, but here's another thing. But you can't go throwing things away or making changes sort of in the dark either. And the thing that I think it's important is that every time we make one of these changes, we did it because we tried to understand what really is the vision of the 1979 prayer book. What is the prayer book about? What is it trying to do? What does it imagine happens in a group of people when they gather for worship? And how can we make that happen? How can we strip away the things that are getting in the way of it? How can we add things in that will help it? How can we make it so that the essential things really rise to the surface and the secondary things either disappear or recede? And so we never, with any of these changes, just said, well, why not? Let's do this just for the hell of it. It was never like that. It was always born out of what I think was we really would look at the prayer book and we'd really say, what does the prayer book imagine? And we would go, let me give you an example of this. So in the prayer book, and we had a little argument about this in the beginning. In this case, I was right. Sometimes we argue all the time. But sometimes I'm right, sometimes Peter's right. In this case, I was right. We were setting up the room, and there is a rubric in the ordination rite that says the bishop now sits on a chair in front of the altar. Do you know that rubric? That's what the rubric says. So Peter said, okay, then we have to move the bishop from his chair around to the front of the altar. And I said, well, why would we do that? And Peter said, because there's a rubric that says the bishop sits in front of the altar. So we then spent a very long time asking ourselves, what is the prayer book really trying to do here? And the answer is the prayer book imagines that scenario. And it imagines getting the bishop out of his throne to the front of the altar, because otherwise the whole thing happens in a corner, right? So what it really means is the bishop needs to move onto the central axis of the room so people can see what's happening. That's what it really means. And so we said, well, in that case, we really don't need to move the bishop because he was sitting in a chair there and the altar was out here and people were all around 6 feet between them. We can leave him there, which actually accomplishes it better, because if we move the bishop's chair up here, half of the people won't see a thing. So every time we'd make a change, we'd really, really work hard with the prayer book as a whole and try to imagine, what is it really trying to get at here? What does the prayer book want to have happen in the room during this service? So I think that's the other thing, though. Just as you can't hold on to things because they've always been done a certain way, you also can't let go of things just because they've done a certain way, and you can't interject certain things just because you think it would be interesting. It's kind of irrelevant what we think is interesting. So anyway, now back to your point that we should let people talk to us.
And I'm going to ask Joelle, who's unaware of this right now. Lorraine? Joelle? Joelle, do you mind just grabbing this microphone over here? And if people have questions to ask, we ask that you ask it in. Joelle can bring you the microphone. And any questions that you may have, we can try and answer.
Come on, don't be shy.
Not all at the same time.
Speaking of prayer book, can you give us any insights on the discussion of a new prayer book?
Oh, God.
And what the focus is, anyway.
It is off topic. I rule against it.
All right. Well, okay. Sure. I do have one primary insight into all of this, and that is because Jesus loves me, I'm going to be dead before it ever happens. That is the first thing I would say about prayer book revision. You know how that is when the way you trust that God will care for you in the future as God has cared for you in the past. So that I know God, having cared for me up to this point in my life, God is going to strike me dead before there's a new prayer book. I don't have a whole lot of insight. I mean, you know the canons. You know all of the hoops that have to be jumped through for a new prayer book to come along. I think undeniably, the prayer book is not even. I mean, there's some things in the prayer book that I think are really ill-conceived, especially new things that we created. And I think that there are... But the prayer book, by and large, still is an Anglican prayer book, with the insights of the liturgical movement of the mid 20th century. It takes all of that into account, so that there's a sameness among all the mainline Christian churches. But it feels to me like our liturgy. My fear, and I know this isn't what you're asking for, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. My fear is that what will emerge from prayer book revision in the current environment is something that is not continuous or organic with our current liturgical life. And I think it will be a loss and a disaster. I think that the prayer book is the only thing that holds us together, really. That's where we articulate, the prayer book is what articulates Anglican theology. I mean, we don't have Martin Luther, in whose writings we can fall back on. We don't have John Calvin's Institutes. We don't have the magisterial function of the Roman Pope. We have the liturgy as we've received it, which is what over 20 centuries, gradually Christians have sort of crystallized as how we believe. We pray the way we pray because we believe certain things, and so I just think it'd be very dangerous. I just think this is a dangerous place in history to be touching their prayer book, personally. So that's my answer, and I shouldn't say this because it's very politically incorrect, but why not? I mean, they can't take my ordination away from me. So I'm sorry. If that is not the kind of answer you wanted, I apologize.
Thank you. This has been very interesting. I'm Bella Engelbach from Trinity Church, Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. How and when
From
did
where,
you...
again, ma'am?
Swarthmore, Pennsylvania.
Oh, we have a rule, by the way, just so you know. When you're talking, you can take your mask off. And I'm not kidding.
Okay.
There
So
we go.
I'm Bella Engelbach, here with my husband Rich from Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. How and when did you bring back the Eucharist?
Can we talk about that?
I can't remember. When did we? We started the weekday services. We started first with the weekday, the 12:15 weekday service, and I think we started off on right after July 4th of last year.
Oh, God, I can't remember.
Yeah, something like that. So we went a couple of months, and I think in September, after Labor Day, around Labor Day, is when we brought the Eucharist back in the Sunday services. And then for the first part of it, it was just in one kind only, in bread. And it's once the bishop said it was okay, then we went to offering wine and bread. We
do not allow people to intinct, so people either have to drink from the chalice or not. We did come to the conclusion that actually it's much more hygienic to drink from the cup than to risk dipping your fingers into the Eucharistic wine. So we don't allow intinction. So that's one thing. But we decided we were not going to celebrate the Eucharist unless we could have a congregation. Oh, now there is a good story to tell.
Which one?
So when we decided to finally come back into the room, we realized that this was really a momentous thing. I don't know how many of you did. We really didn't have anybody in this room for a long time. Like over a year, right? Mm-hmm. We had 2 Christmases and 2 Easters when we didn't have services.
Except for ordinations, and then eventually we had confirmations as well.
And boy,
had to do those.
Ordinations was complicated enough. Confirmations was a nightmare. But anyway, we decided we had to do something really special. And so, the bronze doors there at the front of the cathedral, when you look at them, they don't look very big. They're so big. they weigh so many tons that they literally, the weight of them pushes them down into the floor. So, every so many years we have to spend $1 billion to get all the hinges redone because the doors are so heavy. We only open them very rarely. Like we open them on Palm Sunday we come in through them. On Easter morning we come in through them. On St. Francis Day we used to bring the animals in through them. We don't do that anymore. We take the priest bodies out through them. But anyway,
you'll be walking through them on Sunday as we go out to get our picture taken. So
That's
it's a very special occasion.
Exactly.
Anyway, back to the bronze doors.
We decided to come in through the bronze doors.
Yeah, we gathered outside on the front steps of the cathedral, and everybody came in at the same time for the first time.
And we had musicians all up in the, I don't know if you know, but along the sides here, there's something called the triforium. There are these balconies that run all the way around, halfway up. So we had musicians all up in there. And we had, did Paul Winter lead us in?
Yes.
Do you know Paul Winter, the jazz musician? He's a musician in residence here. So Paul was out there with his
saxophone.
Yeah. And so the doors swing open. We're all out there. We begin. We greet the people. The doors swing open, and then all of a sudden there's this blast of organ music that comes out. And then we all came in through the doors, and no one had been in this room for almost 2 years. And there were musicians all up in the triforium, and the bishop presided, and we all came in. And it was, I don't remember exactly when it was, but I know we made a big deal out of it. It really was that was a great day.
Yeah.
That was really a great day. Yeah.
Question over there.
Good morning. Darren Herndon from the Diocese of Oklahoma. You gave several really good examples of crisis, take advantage, develop change. There were excellent examples of taking advantage of that were great successes. One of the things that we all learn is that sometimes you learn as much or more from the things that you try that either fail or the bishop just says, oh no, and wins the argument. Would you have an example of something that you tried that didn't work, or something the bishop just said no to, that you learned something from that was a very valuable lesson in this time of crisis and change?
You're probably better at answering that because you have more contact with the bishop.
Well, I will say this, and this is important. FYI, let me show my not like with you where I was very private and didn't let you know what I really think. In this case, I'm really very conservative liturgically. I'm like, for me, the prayer book is what the prayer book is. It's not for me to change the prayer book. This is something that we as a church hold in common. I don't get to make decisions about it. I get to use it as freely as possible. So the bishop and I almost never disagree on liturgical matters because he and I are really of one mind on this. So I can't think of anything we've ever suggested where the bishop said, what, are you crazy?
No.
Never.
Not really.
Huh?
No, not really. And I think when you came after a while, and I was on board as well, he's gotten to the point that he trusts what we do. If we figure out that this is the way we need to do ordinations in the middle of the pandemic, he was glad to go along with whatever we said and just tell me what to do and where to be. And I do feel that he really trusts us.
I do too.
That we will do the right thing over here.
Yeah.
So we're lucky in that the bishop is not a problem.
No, our bishop, there are lots of things our bishop disagrees with, but nothing that Peter and I have ever suggested or among them. So there's that. Is there anything else we ever did though during, where we tried to do something and it just was a complete disaster?
Never.
I don't think so. I'm not being. I can't think of anything we ever did that didn't
You would
work.
fire me if it was a disaster.
Yeah, I would fire you. Yeah, you're this close. I don't know.
I can't think of anything that we turned around and said, let's never do that again.
Oh, I can think of one thing. And this was a disaster. We never let it happen. And this is an example of how like what the psychologists call it, functional fixedness. If you have this thing, it can only be used this way. When we got the new altar, we said, well, of course, we have to have a frontal. We have to have a frontal for the altar. That altar is that altar is 6 feet square and 39 inches high, as all altars are. And we had a frontal made for it, a silk frontal that covered the entire thing. And you should have seen how awful it looked. It looked like we were moving. You know how you wrap furniture up when you're moving? It looked right. And it was it's custom made. Everything has to be custom made. It's 6 foot square. And so we sort of just looked at this thing and thought, oh my God, we can't do it. So if any of you need a 6 foot square silk frontal, just go to our account on eBay. But
You think it could work as a bedspread?
it could work as a bedspread. You just have to slice it up a bit. But there's an example of, we said, you've got to have a Laudian frontal on the altar. And the answer is no, you really don't. You really don't.
Yeah.
It
looks so much better as it is right now. And one example is he decided to order the 6 foot square altar.
I
and
asked
it's
you, no, wait a minute. We came in here and we built models, and whether it's 6 feet or 8 feet.
Yeah, but it was your idea originally. But then it's now you go and find linen
That's right.
to put on this altar. And I had to dial around, and I just happened to look at, there was, what's the Roman Catholic Cathedral is it
Los Angeles or Orange County?
What used to be the Crystal Palace.
The Crystal Cathedral.
Anyway, I was watching the service because I wanted to see what this was all about, and it's there's this ginormous square altar over there. So I contacted them, and I think there's one up in Oakland as well, similar size altar. So I contacted them, and they got me a contact of a place that would custom make 6 foot square linen. That came from Belgium. So, yeah, that was an interesting one. But yeah, the altar was definitely something we thought okay, we need to have a frontal, and it looks so much better without it. Next question.
Hello, I'm Margaret McLarty from St. Andrew's Cathedral, Jackson, Mississippi. And I would like for you to respond to where we as the church stand in terms of looking at the reality of the demographics in terms of declining attendance and the age of those who do come to church. We're talking about enhancing the liturgy that we all love so much and not wanting to be too change-oriented in trying to attract something that we don't even know what it is. So can you discuss that, please?
Well, I think for one that when we made changes to the liturgy, the idea was never this, we're doing this to get more people to come or different people to come. We changed the liturgy to see how can we do it well. That's right. And I find that people respond to that. I don't know if you want to mention that letter from the professor from the Netherlands.
Should I call it up? Why don't you keep talking and see if I can find it? It was really a good letter.
Just briefly as to what his comments was. It's somebody who's a professor in liturgy, I believe, that visited the cathedral and had been to the cathedral many times before, and he wrote a letter to the dean discussing what the liturgy was about. I'm sorry to put you on the spot right now.
No, that's okay. I think I can find it. It was a really good letter. While I'm looking for this letter, I do think that it's never going to come up. I do think that we have. I think we have this notion, and I think it's an incorrect notion, to tell you the truth. All right, here I found it. Shall I read you this note? So this came from a professor from Holland, from the Netherlands, who just came here for. And this was January, February, March of 22. He said, "Dear Pat, this is just a short note to thank you for the liturgy in which you presided last Sunday. It is no exaggeration to say that I found it to be the most prayerful liturgy I've experienced in years and that I've ever experienced in the cathedral. As a former master of ceremonies in a cathedral, and as a former lecturer in liturgy, I know that this kind of thing does not just happen intuitively or by accident or because of an unthinking adherence to tradition. Cathedral liturgies in particular to all kinds of bombast prompted in part by the scale of their spaces and in part by the competing voices at the center of a city and a diocese. One often sees either excessive adherence to tradition or some ecclesiastical version of military order, or wild liturgical expressions that seem to be prompted more by the size of the stage than the needs of the praying people. I hope you will not mind me saying that I have seen all of these at St. John the Divine in the past, as I have seen them in other cathedrals across communions and around the world. The trouble with all of this well-intentioned bombast is that it really doesn't help people to do what they most need to do during a liturgy. That is, allow themselves to be transformed by God through participation in the liturgy. In order to facilitate that, what is required is a certain kind of attention and a doing of only what is necessary in the full sense of the word. I do not mean that the liturgy needs to be minimalistic or dour. Celebration can also be necessary. But putting on a spectacle of whatever stripe that may be does not really help people to pray together with or without words. And that is what people are most desperately in need of, since for most of us, there is so little room for this in our lives with others. The way you created an open space, sonically, with lighting, with time, marking the beginning and end of a Lent with silence, immediately focused attention. Somehow in that vast nave, you have created a space that is both intimate and solemn without being burdensome. There was enough room for attention to be focused on what mattered: word, table, prayer, meal, community. The ample room gave space for gentle but deliberate gestures so that the arrival at the altar did not seem... So anyway, it goes on and on. I think that the thing that I want to say about that is this. I do not think young people want relevance, frankly. I think young people want transcendence. I think we live in a world that's flat. And I mean, what I mean by that is there's a kind of a sameness to people's lives. There's a drudgery to people's lives, I think. I don't know what you think, but I think most people live lives of drudgery. And I think young people are stuck in a grind. And I find that most young people are very attracted to classical forms. So I don't think that by sort of taking the liturgy and making it modern, I don't even know what that would look like. I don't think that wins us any fans. So while I do think that we have to be aware of evangelizing young people, I don't think the way to do that is to make the liturgy, what does people even say now? Modern? Or I just think the liturgy is relevant, if you ask me. I think sometimes, though, we have to strip away stuff that seems false. I think young people hate false. They can't stomach it. So I think if we could strip away the things that are false, pretentious, plastic, overblown, and return to things that are clean and simple and direct and honest, young people, silent, lots of quiet, focused, I just think people will want it. At least I think the people who are, and I don't mean this in any kind of exclusionary way, people who are our kind of people will want it. I mean, there will be people, you can't create something that everyone wants, but I think we have something that some people do want. And I think to sort of give that up in the hope of creating something that's cool, I just think we're making a big mistake. But again, that's just me. What do I know? You know, I'm near death. What do I know about young people? and hoping for it, as I said before, prayer book revision comes.
I just wonder, Jay Elmquist from Sacramento, California, Trinity Cathedral. I'm wondering if you have anticipated returning to this space at some point in the future, and as you think about returning to that space, what does it do, first of all, to your heart as you've experienced this? And how does that planning look, and what does that conversation look like in your team?
Yeah, Peter.
Well, that's going to be an interesting conversation. For one, the only times that we would really use this whole space would be Christmas, Easter, consecrations of bishops.
St. Francis Day.
St. Francis Day was always in the cross.
Oh, you're right,
It
you're
was
right,
never
you're right.
up
My
there.
bad.
So, with all the stuff that we've done to reimagine using this space, that will be something that we have to think about. Luckily not for this year, because this scaffolding is staying in the Great Choir until February. But we'll be, God willing, having a consecration of a bishop early next year. One of the things was that we had a piece of artwork that was hanging in this archway around Easter, and it was a crucifix. So we had this space to work with, and what we did is, at that point, we changed everything again. We put the altar sort of in that passageway underneath the sculpture that was hanging there, so we could use both sides of the space.
So the altar was really in the middle of the liturgical gathering.
Yeah.
Half were on one side and half us were on the other.
So that will probably happen this year for Christmas too. But then when we get to the consecration of the next bishop coadjutor, it'll probably happen up there because we need all this space to fill for the people that are in it. So there are times that we will need to use the space, but I foresee less and less use of that area. Because one of the things is if the priest is up there or the bishop is up at the altar over there, somebody in the back there can't see anything. It was like you might as well be in another building.
It literally is 2 football fields long. I mean, that literally is true. So it's very long. I also think, like we used to do the liturgy out here in the crossing. The altar was right here on Sundays, and we only use all of it for big occasions. But there still was kind of a mindset of it being like it was very sort of stage-like, you know. So I do think even when we move back here, we really have to think about this. Because if you look out there and you see the way we use the space, you know, the choir is on one side, the clergy are there, the people are all around. When we're there on Sunday, there's a really great sense of being gathered around. But I don't want you to get the impression that it's like a hootenanny. I mean, it is extremely orchestrated, extremely serious. But there's also this sense of it being intimate that Dr. Irving sort of alluded to, that we can create a sense of intimacy in, you know, the largest church in the United States, but it has to be very intentional. I do think when we move back up, when we have that, see, we have to move back up here when the organ comes back, because the organ is up there. So we'll have to move back into this space. But I do think we'll have to work very carefully to ask the question, how do we do this in such a way that we don't lose what the crisis gave us? And I think we will. We will. We will. You
Well,
will.
I think we're sort of at the end of time here. I don't know if there's one more question that somebody feels that they have to ask.
And sir, who are you and where are you from?
I'm lost.
I know it, and have been since I met you all those years ago.
I'm Dave Moyer from Allentown, Pennsylvania.
I used to be his rector.
Yes, he was our rector for almost 10 years, and he is responsible for redesigning our worship space back in Grace that we use in so many ways. But what I wanted to say is I wouldn't be here without this man up here. He has taught me so much about liturgy and how to do things and why we do the things we do. So thank you, Father Pat.
Dave, did they give you the check yet? Or
It's in the mail.
mail it? Venmo, I'll Venmo you the money.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was worth all $50.
Well, on behalf of the Guild, I want to thank you for being with us. And it's been very enlightening. And I think we've all learned things through the pandemic that we've been fortunate enough that we can break the mold from prior and experience the new. And thank you so much for your presentations. Folks, we're about ready to go to lunch. You got an hour.